remediation. I'm also glad to see that building products makers are now coming within the scope of government and not only property developers, because I personally have been shocked by some of the revelations coming from the Grenfell inquiry, and I do think that potentially we need to address the building product sector. Can I stress to my right honourable friend that speed and delivery here is critical. It is now 4.5 years since the tragedy in my constituency, and what is important is not only having a good plan, but it is executing it quickly and efficiently.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I'm very conscious of the need for speed. I quite agree. If you look at the behaviour of some of the cladding firms, if you look at the behaviour of people who work for Kingspan and Arconic, and the evidence that's been presented to the Grenfell inquiry is truly dreadful. And individuals concerned must take responsibility. And certainly, she's absolutely right. She represents a constituency in which there are many, many people who are trapped effectively because of the failure of the property market to be effectively have all of these problems addressed. And in the interests of her constituencies and so many more, and in particular in the interests of the Grenfell community and their fight for justice, then I'm very conscious of the need to move as fast as we possibly can.
Chair of the Select Committee, flag bearers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for his statement, and I'm sure he will welcome an invitation from the Select Committee to come and discuss these matters further in detail. Just two important issues. First of all, would you just clarify that leaseholders are not going to have to pay the cost of remediation, including non-cladding work? Because that's not exactly what his statement says. And secondly, social housing providers, would he clarify that apart from the removal of ACM cladding, the government's going to give them no help whatsoever? And if developers don't pay for the measures he announced today, or taxes aren't raised, and there are cuts to his budget as a result, is that going to come off social housing provision as well? So what assessment is done of the total impact on future house building of social housing?
Well, three very important points. The first is we will make sure that we provide leaseholders with statutory protection. That's what we aim to do, and we'll work with people, colleagues across the House, in order to make sure that that statutory protection extends for all of the work required in order to make buildings safe. Secondly, when it comes to making sure that we don't have an adverse impact either on social housing or indeed on the work that Home England is leading on to bring together and to remediate brownfield land for new private sector development, we absolutely will make sure that we do everything possible in order to have responsibility discharged by those who are ultimately those with big balance sheets and big bucks. He and I will know that the major 7 housing developers, and indeed they do much good work, but nevertheless, in the last 3 years, they made profits of £16 billion. Those are significant sums which, understandably, people are prompted to ask should be devoted to ensuring that the building safety crisis is met alongside the building supply pipeline of the future.
Rick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome these further measures to provide absolutely critical support to leaseholders and to restore a greater degree of confidence to the housing market? In particular, can I welcome the further support for those in medium-rise buildings? Of course, it's a pity that the Treasury didn't agree to that proposal in January of last year, but such is the way with this issue. Can I ask him 2 particular points? Firstly, he's agreed a backstop with the Chief Secretary, whereby the ultimate risk will be borne by the provision of social housing. I'm sure he would agree that it would be quite wrong for social housing tenants and the homeless to pay the price for solving this issue. So could he say that that won't be the case? And secondly, I see that the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors have failed to make good on the conversations that we've been having for several months, if not years now, to instil a more proportionate and sensible approach into the assignment of risk. What further steps, and he alluded to some in his remarks, can he take against RICS? Because I think their behaviour is now bordering on scandalous in not taking this issue seriously.
Well, can I first of all pay tribute to my right honourable friend and predecessor? I've had the opportunity since joining the department to see just how hard he worked, facing a number of frustrations in order to secure justice for those who are our first concern. And I had some comments from some on the opposition benches seeking to decry that. Honestly, if you knew what I knew about how hard Robert had worked in order to try secure justice, you wouldn't be trying to make a cheap point about it. So no, look, we all care about this issue, but few care about this issue as much, and certainly no one in this chamber at the moment has worked as hard to try to help those people as my right honourable friend. So I'm not having it. And then the second point that my right honourable friend made is absolutely right. We need to ensure both that there is more social housing provision and that we also improve the quality of social housing. That is a core mission for the department. His third point about the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors is right. There have been all sorts of difficulties with that organisation in the past, but I'm now hopeful that we're on a more positive footing. We do have the potential to take steps to improve the governance of the institution, but I am hopeful now that, given some of the conversations we've had, including with lenders and others, that we can be on a more positive footing. But let me once again underline and affirm my gratitude to my right honourable friend for his incredibly hard and dedicated work in order to try to bring this situation to a satisfactory conclusion.
Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Eclipse House, Station Road, Wood Green, have been suffering for over a year now with astronomical costs for gaps around fire doors and external wall insulation. Can the Minister confirm that that's not covered in today's statement? And secondly, what voice will tenants have in the future? Because one of the worst things about Grenfell is the lack of tenant voice to make good things stick when bad practice is all around.
Yeah. The Honourable Lady makes two very important points. On the first, it is the case that those who are the freeholders, the ultimate owners of these buildings, will be held responsible for all of the work that is required, and we will make sure that leaseholders are not on the hook for that. On the second point, she's absolutely right. Those who've had an opportunity to listen to some of the testimony at the Grenfell inquiry, those who've seen some of the excellent campaigning journalism associated with it, will know that people like Ed Defan and others warned explicitly of some of the consequences of the approach that was being taken at the time, and tenants' voices were not heard, and people died as a result. So that's why the Social Housing White Paper, which my right honourable friend did so much to advance, and the Social Housing Bill, which will be coming forward in due course, are so important.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to welcome the statement. I think it's an absolutely brilliant statement, and I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for the work he's done constructively to work with ourselves, cross-party, and the cladding groups to actually get to where we are today. I think what we've announced today is another huge step forward for leaseholders. It's victory for leaseholders. We're up to over £9 billion in support for leaseholders, and we will be making those responsible pay and start on the journey. There are two areas of clarification I would like. The first is cladding is an external fire safety defect, but there are internal fire safety defects developers are responsible for, such as missing fire breaks, and that stops the spread of a fire from one flat to another flat internal in the building. And the second area that I'd like clarification on is, will there be government amendments to the Building Safety Bill to make it clear in law that leaseholders are the innocent parties and will not have to pay?
Well, can I first of all thank my honourable friend for his fantastic campaigning on this issue. And on the first point, it will be the case, and it's linked, of course, to his second point, it will be the case that those who are the owners, the freeholders, the responsible figures in charge of these buildings, who will be held responsible and made responsible for making sure that all the work is done in order to make buildings safe. And we will be bringing forward amendments to ensure that on a statutory basis we can protect leaseholders from having costs passed on unfairly by the owners of the freeholds of these buildings.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Speaker, when the horror of Grenfell happened, many local authorities, like my own, responded immediately and inspected all buildings and took action as appropriate, as they should have done. The private sector did not in the many leasehold properties we have. And I had a very sad conversation with a group of leaseholders a month ago. They're stuck, they can't sell, they can't move, they've got expanding families, and they're completely stuck and faced with massive bills. Can I go to them tomorrow and say the government will underwrite all the costs that they've been threatened with at the moment, so they can get their building brought up to standard and, if they wish to, sell and move on? Or is this going to be months and months of delay until such time as the private sector decides not to pay and the government intervenes? I think those leaseholders, like leaseholders all over the country, deserve an immediate answer. They've been through too much stress.
Well, perhaps for the first time in the House, I'm almost wholly in accord with the right honourable gentleman. I do think that they deserve speedy action, but I don't want to over-promise. I do believe that we can rapidly relieve the difficult situation in which his constituents find themselves. I don't think it can be immediate, but it's certainly my intention to ensure it is as quick as possible. And I also, and again, please forgive me for making this point, I do agree with them that many in local government across party were far quicker to respond to this crisis than some in the private sector, and that's shaming.
Andrew Mitchell.
I do apologise, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much indeed. My right honourable friend will be aware that this whole issue has caused extraordinary misery, anxiety and upset. And I had the opportunity this morning of speaking to Jim Illingworth of Brumlag, with whom he and my right honourable friend from Newark and our friend Jack Jomey have worked so closely, and he was clear that he is very grateful for this progress. We are seeing a mixed economy of response, although there are clearly issues of timing and other details which I have no doubt he will need to address. So I hope my right honourable friend may still accept that he needs to crack the whip on this, but is he not well able to do that?
Well, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for his point, and indeed I had the chance to chat to Jim Illingworth and other cladding campaigners earlier today. And he's absolutely right. I know that as a Birmingham MP, my right honourable friend is all too well aware of how many people in that great city are affected by this crisis, and I look forward to working with him and others to resolve it as quickly as possible.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A retired teacher in my Liverpool Riverside constituency invested in 2015 in a property, but just before Christmas they were issued with a massive bill for £200,000 for an increase in their costs and a possible £9 million for remedial work on their property. So will the Secretary of State agree to meet with me and the leaseholders to talk about how this policy change will benefit them? Thank you.
Well, again, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I will make sure that either I or others in my department have those conversations as quickly as possible.
Mike Penning.
Can I also welcome the statement today, and also the work that the Housing Minister has done with colleagues across the House to explain how the policies were going forward, because this has been a nightmare for leaseholders. Two quick questions. If leaseholders have already paid out these amounts of money, are they going to get that money back from the freeholders or the developers? And secondly, on the issue of insurance, which was raised by my colleague earlier on, does the Secretary of State realise that even though they're liable for the cost of building insurance, they have no rights at all in the policy? So when that situation occurs, they can't claim against the policy, it's only the freeholder can do so, and that must be something that gets changed in the bill.
Well, there are a few people who know as much about fire safety in this House as my right honourable friend, and it is certainly the case that we will work with him in order to explore the specific insurance provisions that he mentioned. I can't, unfortunately, I wouldn't want to mislead, say that we will be in a position to compensate those who have already contributed. What we're seeking to do is to ensure that individuals do not face costs in the future. But again, I will work with colleagues across this House in order to try to get to the most equitable position possible.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to seeing the amendments from the government about how leaseholders will be protected, because my constituents in St Albans have had too many false dawns like many others. But I wanted to ask about the Secretary of State's review of proportionality. In the past, building safety assessors have been chosen because of their willingness to recommend the less expensive safety work, and this has created a race to the bottom. So will the Secretary of State confirm that the BSI guidance will be mandatory for building safety assessors, and will he put protections in place so that assessors don't get away with offering the most light touch mitigations that they can get away with?
Well, firstly, can I thank the Honourable Lady, because always difficult for me to praise a Liberal Democrat, but she's been campaigning consistently on this issue for some time and has done a great job in bringing to light some of the defects that do need to be addressed. Yes, it is the case that the BSI work, we believe, will ensure a properly proportionate approach. There are incentives either way. There are incentives sometimes for some to seek to do work on the cheap, incentives for others sometimes to exaggerate the scale of work that may be required in order to generate business. But I hope that a truly proportionate and safe approach will be now followed as a result of the BSI's work.
Royston Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I joined this campaign a year or so ago because, as the Secretary of State said in his statement, that leaseholders are blameless and it's morally wrong to make them pay. So I look forward to seeing that become part of the bill so that leaseholders will know they will never have to pay. But can I go back to insurers again? Because not only are they increasing premiums by up to 1,000% on people that can't really afford the premiums they were paying before, but they were part of the problem. They were indemnifying these developers, they were underwriting these developments, they are part of the warranty issue, and yet it's not been brought in scope as part of the solution. So can the Secretary of State look again and make sure that insurers have to pay in the way that developers will?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point, and of course his campaigning has been a significant factor in helping us to get to the right position, or certainly to a better position. We want insurers to be part of the solution, as we want everyone to be part of the solution as well. And my right honourable friend Lord Greenhouse is doing great work with them. I think there'll be an opportunity, I'm sure, before too long for me to explain in greater detail with Lord Greenhouse to my honourable friend and to others the progress that we're making, but I think he's absolutely on the button in pointing out some of the mistakes that have been made in the past that do need to be addressed by the insurance sector.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I note that the Secretary of State said that he would extend the right of leaseholders to challenge those who cause defects retrospectively for 30 years. But he will be aware that unscrupulous developers like Mr. Jason Alexander in my constituency exploit loopholes in company law, which mean that there is no corporate entity to go after because it has been wound up, struck off or stripped of assets. Can he say what work he is doing with BEIS to ensure that these loopholes in company law are closed? And can he also say whether the obligations that the developer will now face as a result of his statement today will take precedence over other financial obligations of those developers?
Well, the Honourable Lady makes two very important points. On the first, yes, it's been a feature. I wasn't fully aware until I took on this responsibility of how some within the development industry play fast and loose with the rules and set up special purpose vehicles, shell companies and so on to evade their responsibilities. And they exhibit the unacceptable face of capitalism, I'm afraid. And there is work that requires to be done in order to bring them appropriately to account. She is absolutely right, and I'll be working with colleagues across government to do just that.
Mr. Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State's announcement today, and like others, though, I will be awaiting the detail, not least because I was calling for leaseholders to be protected from the cost of cladding when I was Minister in the department. So what has happened to change the government's mind?
I was going to say, as so often, my right honourable friend is ahead of her time. And there have been any number of occasions, including recently, when I've had to acknowledge that she's been right and the rest of us have been wrong, and this is one of those occasions.
Very good.
Today, the Secretary of State has told us what many all across this House told the government 3 years ago, that individual leaseholders trapped in unsafe homes should not have to bear the cost of making them safe. But today's statement focuses on cladding, when the vast majority of leaseholders are suffering in unsafe homes are the result of other insulation and fire-stopping defects. How will he address that? He also told the companies to pay up, but many have now gone into voluntary liquidation. We need a windfall tax on the whole industry now. Far too many leaseholders have been waiting for 3.5 years in Purda. They now find, many of them, like my constituents in Central Square, they've been waiting since the 31st of July even to get a response from the BSF. Can he actually get his own department to be a bit more expeditious?
Yeah, Honourable gentleman makes a number of very good points. Yes, the department does need to be more expeditious. Yes, we're focused on doing just that. Yes, it's important that those who are the freeholders, the ultimate owners, do deal with all of the fire safety issues. And yes, it is absolutely right that while ACM cladding is simply the most egregious example of buildings being unsafe, there are many other issues that do require to be tackled.
Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement? I think it's long overdue. Many in my constituency and others face huge bills, as he knows that. The biggest problem is trying to get the developers to talk to those that have actually now suffered. I spent 2 years trying to get Telford Homes even to meet with leaseholders, and they've refused, gone to ground and won't say a word. So the question I really got is, how has my honourable friend, with all due respect, because the government's been talking about talking to developers for some time now, but nothing has really come of it, how is he going to drive them to meet leaseholders and the insurance companies for those who actually have gone out of business and they insured them? Taxes can take time. What about fines instantaneously?
Well, by any means necessary, and I think that my right honourable friend is absolutely right. My preference, wherever possible, is to proceed consensually and to think the best of people, and it is undoubtedly the case that there are many people in the property sector and in the development sector who have done the right thing and others who hope to. But absolutely, if we need to, then we will deploy heavier artillery in order to ensure that we get the support we need to those in the front line.
Sarah Jones.
The statement from the Secretary of State is a step in the right direction for sure. I have many tall buildings in Croydon Central, and the complexity of some of their issues are very significant, and the costs of what they bear are very significant, and they don't involve anything that would be covered today. So longitude and altitude blocks, 2 blocks in my constituency that have to pay for compartmentalisation, or Bridge House, which is over 18 metres, is cladded, but the cladding is not categorised as the right cladding to qualify for funding under the government's scheme. I also have constituents who live in blocks where the developer has gone bust, the freeholder is overseas, and they have a very tenuous relationship with the managing agent. It's very difficult to get any information. All of those situations are very difficult. I wonder, on that point, whether the Secretary of State can speak to that kind of wider issue and what can be done there, but also what his estimate is of the cost of making all these buildings safe.
Well, the Honourable Lady makes a series of important points. I know that she's already been in touch with the department, but I want to be more closely in touch with her. Our project team, Operation Apex, are making sure that we can do everything possible in order to ensure that the ultimate responsible owner is identified and takes on the responsibility for the work that she has correctly identified. And so I'll look forward to working more closely with her to address precisely that issue.
Morrissey.
Speaker, may I thank my right honourable friend for standing up for leaseholders, particularly young people who have just gotten onto the housing ladder, and may I ask him to look at sprinklers again as a safety measure. It's required in many countries. It's always perplexed me why it isn't required here, so I would ask that he would look at that. And also the building materials used for social housing. Oftentimes developers use lower quality materials which create a greater safety risk. So if there could be that level of scrutiny for social housing to protect social housing tenants as well.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and was an incredibly hard-working figure in local government in London who helped to ensure that the needs of those in social housing were understood. And it is the case that there are specific provisions in the building safety legislation which has been brought forward by my right honourable friend, the Housing Minister, to address some of those precise questions about poor quality material in social housing.
Samuel Wilson.
It's right that leaseholders should not be held responsible for the faults of builders in the past, and I welcome the statement. But given that housing is an evolved matter in Northern Ireland, I assume that the issues which have been discussed here today will not automatically apply to Northern Ireland. And could the Minister tell us what discussions has he had with the Communities Minister and the Finance Minister, both of whom will be responsible for the housing and the building regulations issue here, given that Sinn Féin seem to take the view that anything which emanates from here, regardless of how beneficial it is to people in Northern Ireland, is not acceptable?
They're very fair points. And I've written to ministers in the Northern Ireland Executive and the other devolved administrations today to outline the approach that we're proposing to take. I will work with ministers from whatever party, and I absolutely take on board the point he makes, in order to ensure that we get to the right position. And I'm grateful, I have to say, to the First Minister, to Paul Given, for the support that he's given us in the run-up to this announcement overall. Much appreciated.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everyone can remember their first visit to Bolton, but on your next visit to Bolton, would the Secretary of State come with me to Holden Mill on Blackburn Road and Astley Bridge to meet with residents to see progress that's been made on the removal of cladding, but also to discuss with them issues around poor build quality and how this government can fight their corner?
I absolutely will, and I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, who's a very, very effective advocate for Bolton.
David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to add my voice to the sudden passing of Jack Jerome, who is truly a pleasant and decent person. I'd like to add my condolences to the mother of the house and especially to his son, Joe Jerome, who I know very well, especially when we were councillors together in Lewisham. Leaseholders are feeling anxious and angry about the delays and uncertainty as to when the cladding will be removed from buildings and associated safety problems also dealt with. This is true of leaseholders, residents of the Parkside development in my constituency. This spring, the developers and the Housing Association have said that they will start to look at doing the remediation work, but they will provide no absolute guarantee that any costs will not be passed on to the leaseholders. Will the Secretary of State look at this case and review it to provide that certainty that leaseholders in my constituency desperately need?
Yes, I absolutely will. Thank you for bringing it to my attention.
Ray Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement and for his sheer determination to not only hold those people responsible for the wrongdoings that they did, but also to stand up for leaseholders. But building owners are still dragging their feet, delaying essential remedial works, even though they might be eligible for government funding. So what incentive can my right honourable friend give today to those building owners to complete the works as soon as possible and not put the concerns about their own financial liabilities, however theoretical they are, above the concerns of and safety of residents in those blocks?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right, and I think that it's certainly the case that many already enlightened owners have done just that. But one of the things that we are saying today is that ultimately we will ensure in law that it's the ultimate owner of the building that is responsible for that work. So the incentive is to move now for fear of consequences later.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to see the Secretary of State acknowledge the unjust treatment of especially buildings under 18 metres. However, it appears that what the Secretary of State's outlined will involve a voluntary contribution from developers, which may take a while. The leaseholders in my Vauxhall constituency don't have a while to wait. They're fed up of waiting. It's been 4.5 years. They want solutions now. So will the Secretary of State confirm that he absolutely understands that urgency that leaseholders want to see and call on those developers to take action now?
Absolutely. Again, I don't want to overpromise, but I do recognise the need for speed. Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the complexity of this issue has been highlighted by my right honourable friend's statement and the questioning. Can I challenge him just on one particular point? As my honourable friend for Hemel Hempstead raised, thousands of people will have received large bills, many will have paid them. My right honourable friend is saying that he will take statutory powers in the bill that's coming before us. When will that happen? And will that be the operational date when this House has voted on those powers for bills then not to be presented to leaseholders from that date forward? Or can leaseholders who've refused to pay the bills thus far say, thank goodness, I don't have to pay anything?
Well, my honourable friend, who's been a consistent campaigner in this area makes a very, very good point. One of the things, again, I don't want to make a cast iron commitment at the dispatch box on the operational date, but one of the things that I will do is work with him and others as we frame the legislation and make sure that he has access, insofar as it's possible, to the legal advice that we have, so that we can stress test it and provide the maximum level of protection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency, I've spoken to many leaseholders who've struggled with issues around fire safety and cladding and the impact it's had on their mental well-being. We raised this issue in committee stage of the Building Safety Bill, and the response was they should just access mental health support through their GP in the usual way. We know the pressure that GPs are under at the moment, so will there be any additional measures brought forward by the Secretary of State in light of his statement to support the mental health of leaseholders?
It is the case that some of the leaseholders face additional vulnerabilities. Some have had mental health problems. There are other leaseholders living with disabilities who have particular problems, and I think it's important that we develop a comprehensive package for all. So I will look into that. Yeah.
Mary Robinson.
And I welcome this announcement and thank my right honourable friend for listening to leaseholders who have faced the prospect of bankruptcy because of the defects which needed to be put right, and confirming that he will also keep in mind that when cladding is removed, other defects may come to light, and would he commit to looking at this as it goes forward, and also to ensure that those bodies who are responsible for this cladding crisis cannot find a place to hide and will be pursued to pay for it.
Absolutely. I totally agree with my honourable friend that we need to take all means to pursue those who are ultimately responsible, and that we also need to recognise that, exactly as she says, when some remediation work is undertaken, sometimes other flaws are revealed and they do need to be addressed.
Mr. Speaker, and I associate myself with all the comments that have been made about my colleague Jack Jerome. I welcome the steps forward that we've taken at every stage when a Secretary of State has come to the House and made a statement. It's the steps backwards that we make after the statements that are causing me problems. I have a property that is about 18 metres high. The residents have done their own survey. They say it's over 18 metres. The management agency says it's over 18 metres and should therefore qualify for building safety fund. And it's difficult to resolve these issues. Meanwhile, the residents are paying out for Waking Watch, and they've been doing that £28,000 a month for nearly 4 years. So how retrospective will this be? Will my constituents be compensated for what they've, I think, had to pay out unfairly, because it would have been far cheaper to put a fire alarm system in than to continue to pay Waking Watch? And will we see an end to the EWS1 forms, or will RICS come back at us and say we can't possibly do that, as they've done before?
No, I can quite understand his frustration, and as my honourable friend, the member for Harrow, pointed out earlier, there are, and as this question lays bare, there are a complex set of interrelated problems. We're making money available in order to ensure that we can get rid of Waking Watch in all but, save a very few circumstances. I recognise that there are people who have faced costs so far, and again, it depends on individual circumstances as to whether or not there are ways, depending on the ultimate owner of the building, whether or not they can receive compensation, but I don't want to make any guarantees about that in a blanket way today. On EWS1 forms, I think we can dramatically reduce their use as a result of the engagement that we've made with lenders and with RICS, but again, it will still be the case that there will be some 11 to 18 buildings in the meantime, even as we get a more proportionate approach, where there will be work of that kind that is required, but we want to absolutely reduce it.
Ben Everett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the commitment of the Secretary of State to hold those accountable who are responsible for this, and that it is morally wrong that leaseholders should foot the bill. I know that this announcement and this progress will be welcomed by residents of Vizian Apartments in Milton Keynes, among thousands and thousands of others across the country. Can he confirm that this means that the government is accepting the principle of polluter pays in this instance? And how confident is he that the cowboys will cough up without additional taxation?
We do accept that principle, and we will do everything that we can to round up the wrong uns. But I do recognise do recognise that we are dealing with some individuals who behaved unscrupulously in the past and who will do everything to evade their responsibilities, which is why we need tax as a backstop.
Howell Williams. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. There are many Welsh victims of this particular scandal, including in my own Arwen constituency and elsewhere in Wales, as I'm sure the Secretary of State will hear now. Now, I'm very much in favour of holding the industry accounts, but I have to tell the Secretary of State that long experience of trying to hold the cavity wall insulation industry to account, albeit as a backbencher, that experience is not encouraging. So I would wish all power to his elbow on that matter. I was glad to hear him say that he will be working with the government in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Can his officials have a look at a particular issue which might be of companies which are working from England and subject to his strictures, of course, but then working into Wales, and that might be a complicating factor?
We absolutely will, and I'm very grateful for the approach that he outlines, and indeed we want to work with the Labour Plaid Cymru administration in Wales in order to get to the right result.
Matthew Offord.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful for the statement made by the Secretary of State today, but I have to gently remind him that those members who have worked hardest on this issue have been those Conservative members supporting their constituents on this side of the House. Two in particular, the member for Southampton, Itchen and Stevenage, who worked incredibly hard upon this issue. But can I ask the Secretary of State to confirm that no leaseholder living in the building or not, in a building of 11 metres or lower, or having problems with external or internal building defects, will have to pay any costs whatsoever?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point and allows me to place on the record my thanks to the members for Southampton, Itchen and Stevenage. And I think their campaigning has been incredibly important in getting us to this point. I completely agree with them. And it is the intention, and we will use statutory means in order to ensure that that happens, that the ultimate owner of a building is responsible for all of the safety steps that are required, and that is what we will seek to do with the help of colleagues across the House.
Fleur Anderson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I also welcome the commitment to leaseholders in this statement and the putting on notice the businesses and the chance to do the right thing. When will the deadline for this chance to do the right thing be up? Otherwise, we could be just kicking the can down the road. Leaseholders in Putney will want to know when they can expect to be able to sell their homes to move on. And will there be a sort of government guarantee, a letter written so that they can move on, something that they can use with estate agents and with others to know that they can move on with their lives? And finally, there is a residence in Putney which is just under 11 metres. They've been given a bill of £1 million for their remediation. Will they be included within this as well? Yeah.
Well, I'll look at the specific case of the building, which falls just under 11 metres, that the honourable lady mentions. More broadly, I'd absolutely love to be able to provide people with reassurance from tomorrow that the cloud will be lifted. But as a number of members have pointed out, there are a complex set of interrelated problems. I believe that we have a means of dealing with them all, but I also appreciate that we really need to move at speed. I'll come back to the House before Easter with an update on the measures that we've taken. I'll work with colleagues across the House in order to ensure that we have the right statutory underpinning. But again, I just want to sort of confirm that we require everything to go right in order to be able to help everyone who's currently facing difficulties. We'll do everything we can, and I hope she'll appreciate that I would not want at this stage to provide an absolute guarantee for people whose specific circumstances I'm not yet familiar with.
Kelly Tolhurst.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I would like to thank my right honourable friend for his statement, which I very much welcome, and I am incredibly grateful to the time that his ministers have spent listening to my concerns and those of the residents at the Wharf in my constituency, who have suffered with a real lack of transparency and clarity around the work that is actually required and if it is needed to be done. But currently they are faced with their management company Y&Y applying to the Tier 1 tribunal for costs as we speak. What assurances could my right honourable friend possibly give my constituents who are very concerned about any outcome that would leave them with bills of between £10,000 to £20,000 payable within the next 6 months?
Absolutely, the intention of today's statement is to try to address the concerns that she's raised so powerfully on behalf of her constituents who face those imminent bills. Can I also say I'm very grateful to her as well for drawing attention to the immensely hard work that's been done by ministers in the department, and the Minister for Housing and Planning, as well as Lord Greenhalgh and the Minister for Rough Sleeping, the member for Walsall North, have all been working incredibly hard to engage with colleagues across the House and to engage with others in order to try to move this forward. And it's been a collective effort, and I'm very grateful to my colleagues for that.
Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's 4.5 years after Grenfell. The Secretary has made clear today that the government have failed to solve this problem, but then says his chief action is to write a letter to developers to ask them to come along to a meeting. That's simply not good enough for the thousands of leaseholds affected in Southwark. The biggest threat in this statement is to allow the backdating of action against those who installed unsafe products for 30 years, but it's leaseholders who will be forced to take the legal and other burdens, including the fees involved. So will the Secretary of State not just amend the Building Safety Bill now to finally clarify responsibility and load the burden where it belongs on the developers, builders and manufacturers to properly protect leaseholders, as ministers have promised multiple times but have failed to deliver in this statement today? Yeah.
Well, the proposals that he enjoins on me are the ones that we're seeking to bring forward. But in fairness to the honourable member, for whom I have a great deal of respect, courageous and doughty campaigner, I can understand a degree of cynicism and or scepticism given some of the missteps that we've had in the past. So I hope that he will, if we do manage to make progress along the lines that he's outlined, I do hope that he'll be in a position then to say that his worst fears were not realised, because I think it's perfectly legitimate for him at this stage to, to want to see the colour of other people's money.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Morello Quarter in my constituency not only has issues with its cladding, but also with other building defects, such as the apparent lack of fire breaks. Can my right honourable friend confirm, will he include these within the scope of these measures, or should I be going back to my residents and telling them to pursue legal action against the developers who don't want to engage with me or with them to try and get resolution for this and certainty?
It is our intention to ensure that those who are ultimately responsible and who are the ultimate owners of the freehold or the ultimate real owners of the building pay in order to ensure that it is made safe. But I will look specifically at the example that my honourable friend raises in order to ensure that we can do everything we can to provide his constituents with the reassurance they deserve.
Stephen Thames.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Will the Minister spell out how the statutory protection he's announced will help leaseholders in developments like Waterside Park, built by Barrett's in my constituency, where there isn't a cladding problem, but the apartments have become valueless because of other serious building defects, missing fire breaks, unsafe installation? How exactly will the statutory protection he's announced help them?
It is intended to ensure that, in this case, and again, I rely on the honourable, right honourable member's description of the particular building. We will talk to Barrett or whoever would be the ultimate owner in order to ensure that they live up to their responsibilities, and there are steps that we can take, and we'll outline what they are when we bring forward appropriate amendments, and we'll make sure that we bring forward those amendments and test them with him and others in order to ensure that they meet the need that he has correctly identified. So our approach is, and there's still a little bit of legal work to be done to ensure that they're as robust as possible.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's statement and the work the Minister has done as well. And I hope it's going to bring resolution to people in blocks of flats in Plough Lane and the centre of Wimbledon at Chorus. Can he confirm that he will expect and, if necessary, require lenders to base their lending decisions in future on the new risk mechanism, because clearly distress has been caused by people being trapped in their houses?
My honourable friend is absolutely spot on, and that is what we will seek to do.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State's been asked from both sides of the House about protecting social landlords and tenants from remediation costs. Will he answer that point, bearing in mind that the biggest social landlords have said that their new housing programmes will cut by 40% over the next 5 years if they have to find fire safety costs themselves? Affordable housing is a particular risk, as yesterday's fire in New York showed. Will he study the lessons of that fire, especially as some of the victims were on the lower floors, which he appears to say are at lower risk, and that lack of compartmentalisation rather than cladding was the cause of most of the deaths?
Well, I know that the honourable gentleman, not least as a former council leader, has considerable experience in this area. He's right that the fire in New York reminds us of the range of risks, and he's also right that we need to take appropriate action in order to ensure that registered social landlords, housing associations and others are not hit adversely. We need to balance a different, set of competing goods, but ultimately, as he will appreciate, the most important thing is to make sure that people are in decent, safe homes, and also to ensure that there are more decent, safe homes built where people need them.
Caroline Notes.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend spoke earlier about lifting the cloud that's hanging over leaseholders. Can he provide reassurance to residents like those in Banning Street in Romsey, where the building is sub 18 metres, where the freeholder is a housing association and where the defects are not cladding related, that they will be swept up in his reforms? They're looking at costs of £15,000 to £20,000 per leaseholder for new fire escapes, which may well not even be needed, but can he provide the reassurance that they will be helped?
I will absolutely look at that specific case. I don't want to say any more at this point, but she raises a very important point. And again, one of the things with housing associations and other registered social landlords is that we do need to make sure that there is an appropriate balance of responsibility there. But I will look at that specific case.
Emma Harding.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Sadly, cladding is not one of the only risks to building safety, and flooding is another huge risk as well. So while the Secretary of State is open to looking at amendments to building safety in general, will he also look at strengthening the standards for all new public and private builds in terms of flood resilience? And also, while we're on this point, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State did promise me a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss my flooding bill, and I'm sure, as a man of his word, that date will be soon arriving in my email inbox.
The Honourable Lady makes two very important points. We have already changed regulation with regards to flooding, but there is more that could be done, and I will make sure that either I or the relevant minister sees the Honourable Lady before the end of February, if that's okay.
Alan Katz.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I warmly welcome the Secretary of State's statement that will yield significant benefits directly to leaseholders here in England. He has already acknowledged that this is a devolved area of policy, and of course the responsibility falls to the hands of the Welsh Government. But the UK Government, through its initiatives, may well raise significant sums of money that will be for this purpose. What conclusion has my right honourable friend drawn on whether that funding should be ring-fenced to be used for that specific purpose in Wales rather than be diverted for other purposes?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a very, very important point, and we of course respect the devolution settlement, but he's absolutely right that money that is generated for building safety should be devoted as far as possible to building safety, and I'll work with him and others in order to ensure the focus is maintained in the way that he outlines.
Daniel Zeichner.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It was a good weekend for Cambridge United, but it wasn't. The misery continues, sadly, for so many people in and around Cambridge who find themselves trapped in buildings which were not built to the expected standards. And as we've heard, it's not just about cladding. It is about fire breaks and so on. And for so many of those people, the lack of an EWS1 form means they're absolutely trapped. They can't move. So what is it in the Secretary of State's statement today that can give them confidence that they're going to be freed from that trap?
Well, can I congratulate the honourable gentleman and all supporters of Cambridge United and extend my sympathies to both Newcastle and Arsenal fans at the unfortunate events of the weekend. Can I also on a very important point he makes, say that I hope that the withdrawal of the Consolidated Advice Note and its replacement with the BSI-approved PAS 9980 will play a part in helping his constituents and others to be in a position once again to operate fully in the operation of the property market. The lenders to whom I've spoken have given our proposals a fair win so far, but obviously engagement needs to continue.
Crispin Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy. In welcoming my right honourable friend's statement today, can I draw his attention to the situation of Nobel House in Redhill, where there are 126 apartments, 86 of which are privately leased. But the ownership, the freehold, has changed twice since the development. The managing agents failed to put in a building safety fund application for the 1.6 billion initial fund. I was told in June there would be a new fund, the 3.5 billion coming forward. That is yet to materialise, and they're now having to pay costs already in for over £2,000 a leaseholder towards the cost of this exercise. Will they get their money back? Can they be fully reassured given the ownership status of the building?
Well, my right honourable friend raises a very important case, and I will look to see what we can do in order to help his constituents. I won't make an absolute promise at the dispatch box at this point, but the situation that he describes is clearly unacceptable.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Shadow Secretary of State said you cannot make a building half safe. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, some residential buildings are possibly even more dangerous than others. In October 2020, over 800 leaseholders and students in the Paragon blocks in Brentford were evicted with 1 week's notice. The buildings were deemed to be so dangerous. They were built by a modular form of building, and the eviction was 2 years after the flammable cladding had already been removed. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have reason to believe that the Paragon, and there are other examples around the country, was as a result of both modular forms of construction for which the out-of-date building regulations don't apply, as well as poor, shoddy, badly supervised construction works. So what I want to know is, when will the Secretary of State be bringing up-to-date building regulations through the system? And secondly, when will the Secretary of State address the lamentable culture in the construction industry that the council at the Grenfell inquiry for the Fire Brigade Union said is driven by an agenda of deregulation, privatisation and marketisation? When's he going to do something about that?
Secretary of State.
Bill really makes an important point about modular construction, and we do require, through the BOPAS guidance, appropriate adherence to principles with modular construction which should keep buildings safe. She's right that the Grenfell inquiry has also had a number of accounts from a number of witnesses which do raise issues of concern. While it's important that we continue to take action even before the inquiry concludes, I wouldn't want to preempt the inquiry's conclusion on all of the issues that she mentions.
Damien Green.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend is entirely correct that this is a substantial step forward, and he and the Housing Minister are to be congratulated on it. Can I return to the subject of those developers and companies that have gone broke and have disappeared since they did the things he's rightly castigated them for, some of them not for nefarious reasons. Has he quantified how much money will be absent, how big a hole there is in the money that ought to be available for that compensation from companies like that, and who is going to fill that hole?
Yeah, no, he makes a very good point. I mean, obviously we want those who we can identify as the responsible owner or freeholder of properties to contribute to, and indeed to meet the needs of fire safety costs. But it's also the case already that we're looking at the wider development community and indeed at construction products manufacturers in order to help to ensure that we have sufficient resources to provide relief to leaseholders everywhere.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In joining the tributes to Jack Dromey, I think our shock is all the greater because we thought he would always be with us, because the whole of his life was dedicated to being there for others, as a representative of workers and being very proud to serve his constituents. I welcome the statement that the Secretary of State has made today represents progress. Loans were never going to work, they were unfair. But my constituents will have listened very carefully to the exchange between him, the chair of the Select Committee, and the honourable member for Harrow West on the question, Harrow East, on the question of liability for non-cladding costs. Because I have many constituents, other members do, the bill is on the mantelpiece. It's staring at them. Given that the Secretary of State has offered statutory protection, what are they meant to do with those bills? Can they confidently say, I don't have to worry about that now because the government is going to sort this out? And when he talks about statutory protection, he mentioned protection against forfeiture and eviction. Can I add a third risk to that list, which is bankruptcy? Yeah. Because that is what many people are facing if they are ever forced to pay these bills they're not responsible for and can't afford.
Secretary of State.
Well, the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right. They're not responsible for these problems. They can't afford the bills in many cases. I wouldn't want to precipitately give advice to any individual at the moment about their particular circumstances without knowing every aspect of their particular circumstances. But I do think that it's vital that we move as quickly as possible. And what I will want to test with the right honourable gentleman and others is the efficacy of the legislative solution that we propose to bring forward, because I'm confident that it will help enormously, but I do want to be in a position where he and others have an opportunity to stress test it so that we get the best possible protection.
Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Everybody welcomes the statement of principle that it's immoral that innocent leaseholders should pay for remediation when it wasn't their fault. But if that's immoral for the future, it's also immoral for everybody who has been pursued ever since the disaster at Grenfell Tower. And therefore, can I urge him to revisit the answers that he gave to my right honourable and honourable friends for Hemel Hempstead and Harrow East, because otherwise he's creating a perverse incentive for people to come down on those leaseholders and extract these rip-off fees before any legislation comes into play, if it's only going to be forward-looking.
Secretary of State.
No, I very much take his point, and we will try to make sure that the legislation deals with the potential perverse incentive he alludes to.
Longfield.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State acknowledged in opening his remarks that the problem isn't simply one of developers' negligence, but is also a failure of regulation for which government is responsible. Leaseholders, I think, will fear that today's announcement will have the effect of kicking a solution further down the road, causing delays for those who have been trapped in an intolerable position for far too long. So wouldn't the Secretary of State accept that the best way of seeking a solution is for the government to fulfil its responsibility by acting to fix the faults without delay, and then using all its powers to recover the money from developers and those responsible?
State.
No, I absolutely take the honourable gentleman's point, but I think that when it comes to some of the regulatory failures to which he alludes, I think that the legislation that we're bringing forward helps to address those. And I also think that it's important that we wait for the conclusions of the Grenfell inquiry before apportioning appropriate weight on the responsibility that rests on central government, the responsibility that rests on local government, and the responsibility that rests on others. But I do believe that the proposals that we put forward today are the best and most expeditious way of ensuring that we can provide support to leaseholders. But of course, we'll keep that under review.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, in drawing the House's attention to my register of members' interests as a chartered surveyor, can I warmly welcome this announcement today? And can I ask my right honourable friend about two aspects that he's mentioned in the statement, namely the indemnity given to building assessors and the proper auditing assessment should enable lenders and insurers fairly quickly to offer those products at reasonable rates, and that in turn will get the market moving so that those leaseholders that desperately need to move should soon find that there will be a market for them to do so.
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. That is exactly our intention, and it's the fruit of the work read by my right honourable friend and others.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. As I've co-chaired the Leasehold and Commonhold All Party Group, can I just pay tribute to all the campaigners up and down the country who have done a sterling job at keeping this on the political agenda, and they will certainly welcome the principle set out in this statement that innocent leaseholders must not shoulder the burden. I hope that applies equally not just to cladding but also to any other fire safety defects and also to the cost of interim safety measures that have been necessary. The Secretary of State recognised that in the statement by referring to an extra £27 million for waking watches, but those leaseholders will have already paid out thousands of pounds for waking watches. Will they now expect some reimbursement for those costs?
Yeah, Secretary of State.
Well, as I've said, firstly, I completely understand and appreciate the concerns expressed by the Honourable Member. What we're seeking to do is to avert additional costs in the future. It's going to be difficult for us to make good all of the injustices that have been visited on his constituents and others. I don't want to oversell what we're putting forward. I think it's a significant step forward, but it can't resolve every issue from the past. May I also say that I hope he won't take this, but I enjoyed listening to the conversation that he and the Father of the House had on Times Radio at the weekend. And I just wanted to say that the very generous comments that he made about the Father of the House, I echo too.
Claire Katina.
Thank you. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his actions today, particularly scrapping the loan scheme for medium-sized buildings, which will help constituents of mine like Susan Seal and the Russell Square residents in Hawley. I also really welcome the onus that he's putting on developers, along with the other things he's talked about. Would he agree that transparency can be an effective tool in getting people to do the right things? And would he speak to whether naming and shaming can be part of the solution as well?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I think one of the things that we saw just before Christmas with the Kingspan Mercedes deal is the way in which public pressure from the Grenfell community meant that a very big corporate Mercedes did the right thing, and I'm very grateful to Toto Wolff and his team for doing that. So I think we do need to use a variety of tools, and she's absolutely right that transparency is critical.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I convey my party and my own sincere sympathies to the family of Jack Dromey at this time of great grief and sorrow. He made a significant contribution in Westminster Hall last Thursday. He will be missed. I want to put that on record. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and for his clear commitment to finding a solution for everyone in this process. It's clear to me that that's what he intends to do. But can the right honourable gentleman outline what steps he is willing to put in place to ensure that the burden of costs of replacing cladding is not on the tenants alone, because currently too many one-bed apartment tenants are being asked to pay thousands towards this in low wages while developers are sitting pretty? And would the Secretary of State consent to liaising with the Chancellor to see what tax breaks could be utilised for those developers who do the right thing by their tenants?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for the points he makes, and absolutely he's right that there are people who are in small one-bedroom flats who've been faced with huge costs which are totally disproportionate and which we need to relieve them of. And secondly, I think the point he makes about being as supportive as possible of those developers who do the right thing is important, because of course we're in a debate like the one that we're having today, we will concentrate inevitably on those who do need to take additional responsibility, but it's really important to stress that there are many developers, many house builders, many in the property sector who have done the right thing, and we should applaud them for doing so.
Kevin Holmrake.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I draw the House's attention to my registered members' interests? Can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement, which I think ticks all the boxes needed to solve this crisis, not least pointing the finger at construction product manufacturers. There's no doubt they have gamed the system to get some of their products approved inappropriately, but that gaming was facilitated by the building research establishment, which, as he knows, was privatised about 25 years ago. Two things: would he make sure that these manufacturers do contribute towards the cost of remediation, but also would he consider bringing the building research establishment back under public ownership?
Secretary of State.
Well, my honourable friend is incredibly knowledgeable about all matters property and housing. On the first part, absolutely. On the second part, that is a tempting thought, but I'll obviously have to discuss that with the Chancellor.
Margaret Ferrier.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Since last April, I've been seeking answers for a constituent in Cambuslang who's been trying to sell a flat between 11 and 18 metres. It was wrongly assessed to have failed the EWS1 form owing to cladding. The Scottish Government have launched a free-of-charge assessment pilot, but details of full rollout and remediation payments are still pending. What discussions has the Secretary of State had with the devolved administrations about remediating buildings across the UK at greater pace?
Secretary of State.
Well, I wrote to him, was in touch with the Scottish Government, Welsh Government, the Northern Ireland Executive earlier today, and I look forward to working with them. I have to say, as I think the nature of this debate has reinforced, there are people in every party who are interested in practical solutions, and that's incredibly helpful in helping to relieve the problems faced by her constituent and by so many others.
Tom Hunt.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome this statement, particularly with regards to 11 to 18 metres. That does include many of my constituents who will get a great sense of relief from that. There is still concern, which has been mentioned by other colleagues, about non-cladding issues. Restoring proportion section of the speech, very interesting, but ultimately, in 3 or 4 months, I don't want to be in the same position of talking to a leaseholder who cannot sell their property because of non-cladding issues, so a proof will be in the pudding. But an issue that hasn't been raised is when this cladding remediation work is carried out, often the living conditions that those who are still living in that building have to live through are completely unacceptable. And I'm absolutely certain that if my right honourable friend visited St Francis Tower in Ipswich, he could not but share my anger at the conditions that my constituents have to live in. So I'd like to invite my right honourable friend to St Francis Tower to see the conditions that they're expected to live in.
Secretary of State.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very, very important point that sometimes work which is absolutely necessary involves a degree of disruption to people's ordinary lives, which is incredibly painful. So whether it's myself or another minister, we'll make sure that someone comes to Ipswich to listen to his constituents. He's an incredibly effective advocate for them, and it's only right that we hear direct from them.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Some of the most distressing conversations I've had with my constituents and distressed constituents I've met have been people caught up in this scandal, trapped, unable to move, facing unknown costs, none of which is their fault. So I and they will very warmly welcome the raft of measures that's announced today. But the next question is going to be, well, what next? What's going to happen and how quickly? And can I urge my right honourable friend to clarify the measures that he's put out as soon as possible and drive us forwards to bring them the certainty they desperately need?
Yes, well, my honourable friend and constituency neighbour is right that people will absolutely want greater detail and greater detail soon, and I look forward to working with him and others in order to provide people with the reassurance required. But as I mentioned earlier, while we believe that the measures we put forward today have the potential to resolve so many of the issues that have been faced, I would not want to say that every single individual's problems will be resolved, but we will do everything we can in order to proceed at speed to help.
Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I refer members to my register of interest. I welcome today's announcements, and I'm sure many of the families in my constituents will welcome it too. But I would like to talk just very briefly with regards to the prevention of fire. We have seen only this weekend the tragedy that has happened in New York, and my thoughts and prayers go out to all affected, as I'm sure I speak for every member in the House too. But this was another electrical fire, and we still have a situation in this country where the question of whether a flat's electrical installation and appliances are tested depends on the tenure of the flat. It's like driving down the road and only rented cars have an MOT. I have raised this before and I will continue to raise this until we can really do something about it. Safe electrics, safe appliances means fewer ignitions, fewer fires, and which means fewer lives lost.
Well, my honourable friend makes an incredibly important point, and of course there are things that we need to do in order to ensure building safety when it comes to construction products and materials and the quality of development and building control. But he's also absolutely right as well that there are fundamental aspects to the wiring and the power supply and the electricity within our homes that do need to be addressed if people to have the safe home to which they're entitled.
David Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Last week I led a debate on the broader issue of developers and house builders making large profits from low-quality homes that cause the owners and the local community problems. Does my right honourable friend agree that the safety issues he seeks to tackle today are on a list of issues people see with these companies, albeit they're the most serious issue, which means that the public will be very unsympathetic if they see further foot dragging to try and get a satisfactory solution.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point, and he's tempting me to go into a broader debate, to which I will return. In a nutshell, it is the case that there are many people involved in housing provision, construction and development who produce safe, beautiful homes with concern for the environment that enhance our communities. And we do need more homes which are safe and decent and sustainable. But it is also the case that there are problems in the system and behaviour by certain actors that does require to be addressed. Everyone in this House wants to work with the industry because having a home of your own is such an important part of all our aspirations and ambitions. But we do need to recognise that there is more work that needs to be done so that we can be proud of the sector in a way that we'd all want to see, and which I know was very much at the heart of the points that he made in the Westminster Hall debate.
I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for escaping the lift at the BBC this morning in order that he was able to come here today, make a statement and respond to questions for over 90 minutes. So thank you very much. We now come to the business of the day, and we come to the programme motion to be moved formally.
I beg to move.
The question is as on the order paper. So the question is as on the order paper. Has been able to say aye? Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Nuclear energy financing bill to be considered.
Now.
We begin with new clause 1, with which it will be convenient to consider the selected amendments as listed on the selection paper. And I call Alan Brown to move new clause 1.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. First of all, can I just express my condolences for the untimely passing of Jack Dromey. Pass on sympathy to his family, in particular the mother of the House. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak to new clause 1 and also amendments 6, 7, 8 and 9 in my name. Now, just to be clear, at the outset, I still oppose this nuclear financing bill. I think it's completely the wrong strategy, but I have tabled the new clause 1 and amendments just to try and improve transparency and see if there's any actual seriousness at all to the ministerial words we've heard about being willing to consider amendments and be open to further parliamentary scrutiny. So, actually starting with Amendment 9, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is all about ensuring that Parliament has a fuller understanding of what sums of money and what commitments the Government is going to be making with regards to any new nuclear project. Now, the Minister has been very good at telling us about the mythical savings that are going to accrue via a RAB funding model introduced by this bill. And it's estimated somewhere between £30 billion and £70 billion is saving. What the Government is not so good at is telling us what money they actually want to commit for the likes of Sizewell C. And in effect, what the Government is telling us, Mr Deputy Speaker, is let us save money for bill payers by signing up to a less bad deal for a new nuclear project. And according to the impact assessment, the capital and financing cost is going to be in the region of £40 to £60 billion for a new nuclear station. So it's a strange logic to me to tell us that £50 billion being added to our energy bills just at the time we've got a cost of living energy crisis is somehow a good thing, adding that £50 billion to our bills. Now, by default, the Government is also confirming just how much of a stinking, rotten deal Hinkley Point C really was for bill payers if we're saying we can save that much money compared to the contracts for difference model for Hinkley C. So we know eye-watering sums of money are intended to be committed, but however, the bill as it stands gives the Secretary of State carte blanche to sign off on a new nuclear deal. So Amendment 9 tries to address this and set out key criteria which should be laid in a report before Parliament. Now, during committee stage of this bill and at other times when quizzed on cost transparency, we're given the contract that, oh, we can't share that information for commercial confidentiality reasons. But the reality is, if Parliament is told the capital cost of a new power station is something like £23 billion, which is the current estimated cost for Hinkley Point C, We don't actually know what the breakdown of that £23 billion is, so there's no way that would breach commercial confidentiality. And we've got a right to know what upfront costs are being committed to or forced on bill payers. And it's important we know for any deals in the sale of electricity. Now, at the moment, the government tells how much money the RAB model will save, as I said, and they want to continue to be vague on how much a new project will actually cost. Now, we'll have the smoke and mirrors argument that it's a basic RAB payment that somehow in the future gets partially negated with the sale of electricity to the grid. Now, at committee stage, the Minister also argued that if somehow the capital cost of the project was known, it would be harder to raise capital in the private markets. But that seems to me to be a nonsense argument when other infrastructure projects have their costs put in the public domain while capital is still to be raised. And I'd have thought it's advantageous to have it in the public domain to know how much capital is required to be raised to actually generate competition and, for that capital investment. Indeed, initial capital raising discussions would actually need to have already been held to get some assessment of the viability of the project as it was being developed. So the lines about market sensitivity and best value just don't stack up as a counter-argument. But we also need to know what other costs are committed to during the anticipated construction period. Now, under the current RAB proposals, consumers will start to pay money as soon as construction begins, but they're not actually committed at least to the full construction cost because that gets spread out over the 60-year operational contract period. But I think it's only right that bill payers know what costs are getting committed at the outset before that final sign-off of the 6-year contract. So Amendment 9 also tries to get transparency with regards to the sale of energy. So while we're told there won't be a strike rate, it's not credible for me to believe that something like £50 billion worth of capital and financing costs are going to be committed for a 60-year operational plan without there being sufficient confidence in the returns from the sale of electricity. So I really do think ministerial clarity is required in this, and that's why it would be good to have the government committed to having to report on that. Now, for example, in a briefing in favour of this bill from Prospect Union, they come up with a ridiculous supposition that if energy prices in the market are the right level in the future, then the RAB payments could actually reduce to zero. So are we seriously supposed to believe that this is a credible proposition? And equally, are we supposed to believe that if wholesale electricity prices drop to a certain level, which is way below the operational costs of the nuclear plant to generate electricity, that nuclear company will just carry on regardless because they carry all the risks? So it might not be a strike rate as we understand it in terms of the contracts for difference scheme, but it seems to me, given the scenarios I've painted there, that some sort of guarantee is going to be looked for, and it might be a minimum floor price in the sale of electricity. So if so, we should know about it as parliamentarians and bill payers. And if there isn't a minimum floor price in the future, and the risk lies with the developer or it's somehow baked into the RAB payments, we should also know and understand that as well. Otherwise, it would seem to me it's continued closed-door negotiations hidden from the public who are actually paying for it. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, Amendment 9 tries to shine a light on what would otherwise be this closed-shop negotiation by a government who still hasn't learned the lessons from their desperation to sign off in Hinkley Point C at any cost whatsoever, and they seem destined to do so again with Sizewell C, just this time with a different model, and the bill payers actually carrying a greater level of risk through the RAB model. Now, I'd expect any parliamentarian in here that believes in some form of parliamentary scrutiny would actually be happy to have the Secretary of State obliged to report on the capital cost, any upfront committed costs and any future sale of energy contracts as a basic form of transparency, which is what Amendment 9 seeks to do. Now, one other important aspect of Amendment 9 is regards decommissioning. Now, we know at present decommissioning and tidying up existing nuclear legacy is another albatross round the necks of taxpayers. An estimated £132 billion is to be spent in the next 100 years. And this is a sum that increases every time the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority gets new information and updates the estimate. Now, we're told, in this case, decommissioning going forward is baked into the upfront prices of the contractual agreement. So Amendment 9 has a section that tries to elicit more information on this aspect. Now, we understand construction can take 10 to 15 years, and then thereafter there is supposed to be the 60-year operation of the new nuclear station before decommissioning occurs. Now, the defuelling stage It takes up to 5 years before the rest of the site can be properly dismantled. So how robust do we believe the decommissioning costs will be that are baked into the upfront contract, which means they're actually estimated something like 75 years ahead of when the decommissioning task is supposed to begin? It's clear that there are massive financial risks surrounding this, and also it seemed to me insurances or bonds must be required to have any chance that liability just doesn't pass to the bill payer in the future, especially if the nuclear company becomes insolvent. And we also need protections to ensure that it actually doesn't become an attractive proposition in the future for a company to become insolvent and simply pass on these liabilities. And the final section of Amendment 9 seeks to get some clarity for Parliament on these considerations. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, if I turn to Amendment 6, this too is about transparency of costs. Now, in this case, it's about the upfront costs or the costs borne by the taxpayer. Now, much of the rationale of this amendment is because of the budget commitment of £1.7 billion, which in the Red Book says to enable a final investment decision for a large-scale nuclear project in this Parliament. Now, that's an astonishing sum of money to commit taxpayers to. And in committee stage, the Sizewell C Consortium stated they've no idea where this £1.7 billion comes from, and the Minister still hasn't been able to explain it to me, either in committee stage or in a form of a written question. So, again, I suggest that for full transparency, parliamentarians need to know what money is being thrown at nuclear projects up front and what the likes of this £1.7 billion actually procures. At the moment, all we know is this is what Treasury thinks is required to get Sizewell C to final investment stage. But this is a sum of money that could otherwise be used to see major construction of renewable projects, money which could see the Corrie Glass pumped hydro storage scheme constructed and the Cruachan Dam pumped hydro extension undertaken as well. Instead, at the moment, it looks like it will be spent in design, accountancy and lawyer fees. And this is despite the fact that we're continually told Sizewell C is practically designed already by utilising the design from Hinkley Point C. And if this money for development is for other purposes, such as has been mooted as a stake in the consortium, then we still should know that and know what the money has been utilised for. And it shouldn't be too much to ask this of government and for them to accept Amendment 6. Now, if I turn to Amendment 7, then this amendment tries to get some clarity in the operation of the plant going forward. Now, the great myth, Mr Deputy Speaker, of nuclear power is it's supposed to be so reliable and it provides base load. But the fact that nuclear power is required for when the wind doesn't blow, we keep hearing. But the reality is nuclear is too inflexible to be properly compatible with intermittent renewables. And the reality is a nuclear station is either on or it's off. That's the limit of its flexibility. Now, in an answer to a written parliamentary question I submitted before Christmas, also seems that nuclear power stations tend to be off for way longer than would be the case to be expected if nuclear power is so critical and so reliable. Looking back since 2010 and a year-on-year average, each nuclear station is down for nearly 25% of a typical year. If you look at Hartlepool, each reactor is down for 90 days a year on average. Dungeness was nearly 200 days a year on average until its early closure. And even Sizewell B, the youngest power station in the existing fleet and the greatest remaining lifespan, has been non-operational on an average of 64 days a year since 2010. So it's truly astonishing, that to me, and again it destroys the argument about why new nuclear is required. Now, as one of the witnesses at committee stage stated, each nuclear station actually requires further nuclear as a backup because of all these outages. Now, what Amendment 7 does then is it provides Parliament and bill payers at least some clarity on how the new station is performing in terms of its ability to be generating electricity at times of need. Now, Amendment 7 also provides for annual reporting and assessment of the condition and operability of the station, because if we look at the existing fleet of nuclear reactors, we've seen how the anticipated lifespan and operation of the plant can change quickly, with Dungeness closing 7 years early. Now, considering how it was actually effectively offline for the preceding 2 years, then had Dungeness been subject to report requirements for what I'm asking for here, then at least Parliament would have understood the situation at Dungeness, and it probably elicited more questions from parliamentarians in terms of state of that power station. And if we're looking at a 60-year operational contract, when, bear in mind, no nuclear power station in the UK has went to a 50-year milestone yet, then it's important as that nuclear power station plan ages that parliamentarians and bill payers understand the performance of the station and critically its operational lifespan and any liabilities and repairs that are required, which is what Amendment 7 seeks to do. Now, Amendment 8 is linked to the operation of the plant, and this allows for penalties if the plant is down too long. It seems logical, if we take the government argument that nuclear power is so critical, then they need to minimise the risk of extended outages. So Amendment 8 does this by at least having the ability for the government to impose penalties and seek financial recovery if the station is down for too long. And I've inserted a suggested timeline of 60 days, which I think is a reasonable point for penalties to kick in, especially when we look at the recent historical performance of the existing fleet. And that actually, in looking forward, that still allows that station to be down for 15% of the time in a typical year before penalties would be incurred. Now, Amendment 10 is also about transparency, this time in the event the nuclear company becomes insolvent. It's only right that the taxpayer understands the liabilities that the government are willing to pick up in the event of insolvency, and being compelled to report the cost of getting a plant operational again, what its remaining lifespan is, and any other liabilities that might not be covered anymore due to insolvency, such as decommissioning, might at least focus minds on the merits of continuing to operate the plant or not. Otherwise, we remain in the position the Secretary of State could be writing blank cheques that Parliament is unaware of. Yep.
Very grateful. He's raising some important questions about cost and reliability. What is his recommendation as to what the government should do to make the position better?
Well, my ideal recommendation would be not to invest in a new nuclear plant. That would be the first thing. But if we take it as it is and we're looking at this going forward, for me, the government needs to, first of all, satisfy ourselves with the design, which, bear in mind, the EPR system is still not working anywhere in the world. But that's the whole point of this amendment, is about at least having yearly assessments and reports to Parliament that would actually advise on that reliability. And as I say, that would allow other parliamentarians to understand that, challenge the government if need be, and help put pressure on that nuclear consortia if it wasn't performing to plan. And that for me is critical. It's actually getting what's actually signed up for going forward.
Will you give way?
Yeah, I'll give way, yeah.
I thank him for giving way. Does he agree with me that actually increasingly the view that we need a permanent baseload for energy supply is outdated thinking, and that most modern thinking around the idea of energy supply all day, every day, is that we don't need this idea of baseloads anymore?
Yeah, actually, I agree wholeheartedly with that. And actually, as far back as 2015, Steve Halliday, the then Chief Executive of National Grid, actually said baseload was an outdated concept and a false argument. So I agree with that. And again, it goes back to my point that nuclear is actually too inflexible because it's either on or off. Yes. And it's actually nuclear that leads to wind turbines being turned off so often as well. So that's a bizarre thing. Nuclear's got a hidden cost because of the energy constraint payments that are made. If I return to the amendments, Mr Deputy Speaker, our Amendment 10 is actually made to Clause 32, as is Labour's Amendment 5. However, I would just point out, as I stated at committee stage, I don't support the Labour amendment because I believe actually compelling the government to take over a plan which is confirmed to have been economically unviable then is throwing good money after bad, which is actually the polar opposite of the rationale behind our Amendment 10. But to be clear, I certainly support all the other Labour amendments, particularly the ones about foreign ownership, and I'd be happy to support them if it goes to vote. And finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, people will be glad to know, if I just turn to new Clause 1, this too is another attempt at transparency in what could otherwise be the Secretary of State committing huge sums of money via the specialist administration route. I do not think it too onerous, again, for the Secretary of State to have to report to Parliament on the likely costs of what is the bailout of an insolvent company. Now, at committee stage, the Minister argued that this would hamper the process, but given the SAR process has only actually just been implemented for the first time at the moment through a bill going bust, it's unclear to me why a report to Parliament is going to unduly delay what could be a complicated process going through the courts anyway. And the Minister also stated that the court process would provide enough transparency, but also that the reporting requirement might have commercial implications and affect the Secretary of State's ability to bring administration to an end. Now, both aspects of these cannot be true. There's either enough transparency or there isn't. And it seems to me somehow reporting to Parliament shouldn't hinder that transparency process and shouldn't have commercial implications. So that's why this clause has been put forward, to ensure clear reporting of information to Parliament. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, I made it clear from the outset that this bill lacks transparency. Clauses 2 and 3 give way too much power to the Secretary of State to assess what he or she believes to be a value for money nuclear project and then commit bill payers to paying for it. And so while I'm opposed to the bill, I haven't even proposed wrecking amendments, because these amendments today are all designed to ensure, firstly, parliamentarians, and secondly, bill payers know exactly what money has been committed to and for what reasons. And if the Government has faith in its arguments that nuclear energy is required and that it represents true value for money, then it would seem to me the Government should willingly accept these amendments and new Clause 1. Otherwise, if the amendments get defeated in votes, then we know it's all about continued backroom deals. The fear won't stand up to scrutiny if they're actually to report on the actual sums themselves.
Report on proposed payments to a nuclear administrator or relevant licensee nuclear company.
The question is that new Clause 1 be read a second time. Sir John Redwood.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I welcome proposals that will create more generating capacity in the United Kingdom. As the Minister knows, I am extremely worried that we are already typically 10% dependent on imported electricity, and that the current plans envisage us becoming more import dependent, with a preferred route for electricity provision being the construction of more interconnectors. And I'm worried about this both on security grounds, because we link ourselves at our peril into an energy short system on the continent of Europe, which is far too dependent on Mr Putin and Russian gas. And I worry about it because we are short of electricity and gas at the moment, and we see the price pressures that creates, and I think we should be doing more to expand the supply of both electricity and domestic gas. And I think the SNP have made some important points, although they come at nuclear power from a different perspective to that of the government, that whilst we could usefully enjoy more nuclear power, it is very important those projects are timely and cost controlled and are technologies which will deliver reliable power on a sustainable basis. So I have this question ready for the Minister. Does he agree with me that nothing in this legislation and nothing that he can now do can prevent the proportion of our electricity generated by nuclear declining for the whole of this decade? Because as I understand it, these projects take so long to get type approval and financing and then in construction. And as I also understand it, all but one of our current nuclear power stations is scheduled to close by 2030. And although we have one large nuclear power station that should come on stream during that time period, it will not offset all of the capacity which is taken out. So it would be misleading to suggest that nuclear power can do anything to solve our problem this decade. Now, I don't want to get in the way of it solving the problem for a following decade. We do need to think ahead, and these are very long-term projects. But the context of this debate is that we are energy short for the next decade, and even with best intentions with this legislation and the possible schemes that would come under it, we are not going to do anything to contribute to resolving our energy shortage in the decade that we now face. And I'd also like his thoughts on the pace of rollout of nuclear power, if this bill goes well and is passed through with suitable amendment. What would he expect to see by way of incremental capacity for the following 2 decades after 2030, if all went well with the ideas embedded in this legislation, and given the state of technology, the rather imperfect supply of capacity, and above all, perhaps, whether he's got plans for smaller nuclear where it might be possible to more quickly approve a project and then to scale it up and roll it out in more than a few locations.
I thank you for giving way on that point. I mean, the purpose about small modular nuclear reactors is because we're going to be building 10 or 15 of them. We're going to be able to bring the price down, which is one of the points made. But is he also concerned that there are now 18 major projects in oil and gas exploration which seemingly are being put on hold when we need these projects and these fields to come online now?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, yes, I fear I may be wandering a little from the actual bill, but given the general context of energy shortage and given the crucial role that gas has been playing in recent months in generating electricity, because we are short of nuclear power and we're short of wind power when the wind doesn't blow, I would strongly recommend that we get on with exploiting our own gas reserves because it's greener and cheaper than relying on gas brought halfway around the world in an LNG tanker or relying ultimately on Mr. Putin's gas routed via the continent. So I think that's probably an argument for another day, but I'm grateful for my honourable friend and I'm very grateful for the Deputy Speaker to allow me to answer that very good point. So in conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would like the Minister to set out a little bit more of the context of when nuclear might start contributing to our electricity demand and need, how he sees the balance of that developing between possible small nuclear rolled out at greater scale and one or two large nuclear projects which may still be around. And would he also agree with me that given the hugely radical electrical revolution the government wishes to encourage, to switch home heating from predominantly gas to electricity and to switch much transport from predominantly diesel and petrol to electricity, we're going to need a massive expansion of total capacity, and yet we start from a position where we don't have enough capacity for the current levels of our demand, and where the nuclear element in that is actually contracting quite a lot over this decade.
You're a Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. As a lifelong anti-nuclear power campaigner, I couldn't miss to fail to speak in this debate and also represent the views of the many Bath constituents who have written to me over the last weeks and months to vote and speak against this bill. We need to get to net zero by 2050 at the latest. Do we need nuclear power to get there? And is nuclear energy a fair deal for our consumers? While nuclear power is not a carbon fuel, it is enormously expensive, costing twice as much as generation from renewables. And in answer to the honourable member who's just spoken, I just believe we just need to roll out renewable energies because we have got the capacity. We are, as Britain, a country that is surrounded by sea and a lot of wind even further out. There's projects like floating wind out there. I speak a lot to that industry. If only the government had the political will to actually make that renewable energy revolution happen. I'm happy to give way.
But what difference would it have made if we'd had double the amount of wind capacity in some of those weeks recently when it was only supplying 2% of our total electricity because there was no wind?
I thank him for giving way. As I said, compared to what the potential of offshore wind actually is, particularly further out, where the wind is blowing all the time and he only needs to talk to the industry, where we can actually, if the government was prepared to invest much more into offshore wind and not just rely on the small projects that we currently have. Yes, we have doubled our capacity of offshore wind thanks to the Liberal Democrats in government some time ago now, but there's still no level playing field for the renewables energy sector. They come and speak on this again and again and again. If only the government was prepared to actually set a regulatory level playing field, we could see a lot more renewable energy to cover our energy costs. So, let me repeat, Mr. Deputy Speaker, while nuclear power is not a carbon fuel, is it It is enormously expensive, costing twice as much as generation from renewables, and the cost will in the end fall on the consumer. We have seen the disasters of that in recent years and in recent weeks. Quite apart from the long-term cost of decommissioning, disposal and storage of waste, nuclear is an unusual technology that sees costs rise over time instead of fall. In other words, it has a high need for government subsidy. The government says that this bill is about saving money for consumers by removing barriers to private investment in the nuclear sector. But this is misleading. The government's proposed funding model, regulated asset base, provides no protection for consumers. Instead, the evidence shows that costs for abandoned nuclear power stations were still passed on to consumers under this model. Let's look at what happened in the US, where a version of the regulated asset-based model was introduced over 10 years ago. It was called early cost recovery. As in Britain, ECR was sold to policymakers as a way of lowering the cost of capital, thereby making nuclear power more competitive with other generating sources. But the lower capital cost was not a true saving. At its 2009 peak, the nuclear renaissance consists of application to build 31 units pending at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. 29 of the 31 have been cancelled, despite expenditure exceeding $20 billion. No new US nuclear plants have gone into service. In South Carolina, ratepayers are now having to pay $2.3 billion for a cancelled nuclear plant, while the US electric customers are exposed to paying more than $10 billion for cancelled nuclear plants and another $13.5 billion in cost overruns. No reactors have come online as a result of the US shift to early cost recovery. Florida and South Carolina have repealed the laws allowing early cost recovery. No states have enacted such laws in the last decade. So why on earth is the Tory government introducing a failed financial model from the US? In contrast, the cost of renewables are falling globally. Renewables are significantly undercutting fossil fuels as the cheapest form of energy as the cost of renewable technologies fall. According to the International Energy Agency, the world's best solar power schemes now offer the cheapest electricity in history. I won't give away again. Renewable energy is the future, and we in the UK are ideally placed to take advantage of the wind and wave power all around us. And when tidal wave projects have been cancelled in the past by the UK, it was always on cost basis. Why don't we look at those projects again, because they're truly renewable and they're truly the future. We could be an exporter of renewables. Onshore wind is now the cheapest form of electricity generation in the UK.
Order, I have been incredibly generous, as I was to Sir John. Could the Honourable Lady tell me which clause she is speaking to?
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm coming to the end.
Okay.
Yes. As I said, I couldn't miss to speak in this debate because I believe the whole bill is a complete failure. But I will be supporting all the amendments that are proposed today because they are improving the bill, but I will be voting against the bill. Thank you.
Virginia Crosby.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak in this nuclear energy financing bill debate. As the co-founder of the Nuclear Delivery Group, along with my fellow atomic kitten, the Honourable Member for Copeland, I've been at the forefront of campaigning for nuclear energy to form a key part of our 2050 net zero strategy since becoming the MP for Unismorn. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can talk about the various amendments tabled by the opposition, but the reality is this bill is critical if the UK is to tackle climate change. It's critical for the UK's energy security and stability. The demand for electricity will only rise as we phase out carbon-based energy. Whilst renewables like solar, wind and tidal energy must form part of our zero-carbon mix, they simply do not currently offer the capacity or reliability that we will need to go forward. Nuclear power is the only viable alternative to fossil fuels that the UK can implement in the timeframes required to... Of course I won't give way.
I thank her for giving way. So when she speaks for amendments, so she explained why she opposes any of these amendments, because I'd have thought putting forward amendments about transparency and just highlighting the costs of nuclear would be a good thing.
Several of the amendments you mentioned related to information flow and financing, and I'm going to be talking more about the financing and how that is so important to my constituents on Honest Morn. And in recent years, we've seen our nuclear generation capacity drop and UK progress on the decarbonation of power stall. Over the past year, I've been working hard to raise the issue of financing for nuclear power with ministers and officials because it is a key blocker, Mr Deputy Speaker, to bringing more nuclear power online. The majority of my constituents support Wilvernowath. It's recognised as the best site in the UK, possibly the world, to host a nuclear power plant. And I'd like to end by saying this bill will make a huge difference to Honest Morn. My constituency has one of the lowest GVAs in the UK. We desperately need these jobs to come through. And I would like to say that on behalf of the Nuclear Delivery Group, thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank all of my constituents, and in particular the community of Llanbadrig, for remaining positive and united in the hope that Honest Morn sees the fruits of this important piece of legislation.
So it would be really useful when people are contributing to this report state that they could mention some of the amendments or the new clause now and again. Charlotte Nichols.
Charlotte, I'm sorry. Take my mask off. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome the return of this important bill from committee stage, and I'm pleased to support it, as of course is the Labour Party. Indeed, while our NHS is the Attlee government's greatest achievement, it was his Labour government that approved this country's first nuclear reactors, which have been supplying clean energy ever since. It is regrettable that it has taken the Conservatives over a decade in office before they have brought forward these new plans to finance and ensure the next generation of nuclear that we need. I'm concerned that much of our domestic expertise and supply chain capacity has eroded in that time, but it is still true that if the best time to build a nuclear plant was 10 years ago, the second best time is today. It's especially important with the retirement of Hunterston B last week, which alone provided 1 gigawatt of the UK's 7.9 gigawatt nuclear capacity, enough to power 1.7 million homes. As our energy bills rocket in the months to come as a result of huge volatility in the international gas markets, we will be reminded yet again of the importance of the diversification, sovereignty, security and constancy of our power supplies, something which is addressed in Labour's amendments. Ensuring a further generation of nuclear plants is the best way to address this, as well as being environmentally sustainable as we seek net zero. There are too many myths about nuclear power that undermine it in the public mind and in pockets of this place. Let us hear the facts. Nuclear power has the lowest life cycle carbon of all technologies, the lowest land use of all low carbon technologies, the lowest mining and metal use of all low carbon technologies, and the highest employment multiplier of all low carbon technologies. Those peddling these myths rely on misleading comparisons, over-optimism about alternatives, and wholly outdated concerns about safety that don't reflect the reality of modern nuclear plants. We shouldn't be scared from making the positive case for nuclear and making it strongly and proudly. Nuclear is safe, reliable, and directly creates quality, high-paying, unionised jobs, as well as supporting many more in its supply chain. I declare an interest, as Warrington North has the third most nuclear jobs of any constituency in the country, despite not having a nuclear plant. And indeed, just recently I visited Hinkley Point C with the nuclear APPG to see for myself the fruits of the labour of thousands of my Warrington North constituents who work in its supply chain, alongside many other nuclear workers on all aspects, from new build to decommissioning to nuclear medicine and nuclear propulsion for spaceflight. Maltex in Birchwood in my constituency, for example, is currently working on stable salt reactors, which would actually recycle nuclear waste from older fleets of reactors by using this as the fuel for future fleets. These are good jobs in stark contrast to the increasing casualisation of our labour market and the gig economy more widely. high-quality apprenticeships, including at the University Technical College in Warrington, working with employers like Sellafield, open up great opportunities for my constituents in high-skilled roles in a world-class industry. We are proud of them and would welcome many more. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. I just wondered if she had any figures on how many of those jobs in Warrington might be put at risk by the exclusion of companies that are part foreign owned, as Labour's amendment might keep out of new nuclear build if the amendment was passed.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. I don't have the data on my person at this point, but ultimately I think more jobs are at risk in Warrington North in the nuclear sector if we don't approve the building of new nuclear, and that's something that, whether it's direct state investment, whether it's a regulated asset-based model as we're discussing today, or whether it's foreign investment, the fact is that we need to get those built because all of those jobs will be at risk if we don't. And as going back to the point that the honourable gentleman raised there, we've heard complaints about the cost of the regulated asset-based model, and indeed my preference would be direct state investment into this vital national infrastructure that keeps the stations and the power they produce in public ownership. But nonetheless, the model that we're discussing today must be recognised as an investment that guarantees construction and production over the longer term. As I wind up my remarks today, I want to point out that it is this uncertainty and lack of guarantees that have left the industry in the dark for so long. With these certainties now addressed with this bill and the amendments which Labour are tabling today, the industry can now have the confidence to plan and move forward. My hope is that the signal that we will send today by passing this bill on a cross-party basis, that there is a clear consensus on the vital role that nuclear will continue to have in our energy mix. This message is fundamental as we hopefully move on from Sizewell C to other projects, and planning these as a fleet to both drive down costs and maintain and indeed expand the world-class expertise and skills of the British nuclear sector.
Bob Seeley.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm going to speak to Amendments 1 and 2. If I've got time, I'll get in Amendment 9, but I'll speak for no more than 5 minutes. But just by way of an overall approach, I mean, I hear what people say about the importance of renewables, but it's not renewables or nuclear. Frankly, if the world is going to have any chance of meeting its carbon targets, it's not either or, it's and. And I'm afraid to say, when you see the environmental, energy and security disaster that is Germany's imbecilic energy policy caused by the shutting of nuclear, the dependence on Russian gas and lignite coal, the dirtiest form of energy production known to humanity, gladly.
I'm not speaking on behalf of Germany, because Germany is, of course, in a very different position to Britain. It is more or less landlocked. It doesn't have sea. It doesn't have wind in the same way. Britain has got a massive opportunity to invest in new renewable energy that no other country has apart from, for example, Greece, and they're doing that.
And I think my German relatives would confirm that they have wind in Germany. And the Baltic Sea. Thank you very much indeed. Including reports from the UN and others, there is no reputable case that disagrees that if we are to meet zero carbon at some point in a realistic, next 20, 30, 40 years, whether we like it or not, nuclear is going to play an increasingly significant element of that. It is a very low form of carbon energy, no greenhouse gas. I will make some progress and then I will give way again. And I think it is important to take that on board. When it comes to foreign ownership and foreign funding, would I start from here? No. I'm uncomfortable about the idea that we would ever want to build an untried, untested Chinese nuclear reactor in this country, especially one that has not been built anywhere else, to say nothing of the geopolitical ramifications of that. I'm not hugely happy that we have Chinese funding in place at the moment. But I understand that actually the purpose at the moment and the critical point is that we need a sense of momentum to make progress on this issue. So in a perfect world, we would not be starting from here. I'll give way now if you'd like to come in.
I thank him for giving way. He was talking earlier there about the importance of nuclear to get to net zero, but the UK government's actually committed to decarbonisation in the electricity grid by 2035. So there's no way on earth, if we're going to rely on nuclear, that can actually fully decarbonise the grid. It's other things that are needed. It's carbon capture and storage, it's green hydrogen.
Again, he's making a perfectly sensible point, but I think his argument's frankly a bit of a cop-out, that we can do it all with renewables. We're not. I want